tend to think that there has to be some kind of generic character common to both terms in order for there to be some kind of interaction or some kind of causal relation of some kind. But for me, both of these terms have a genetic character in that experience out of which we create those categories or create those terms. So in a sense, the way that I go about doing it, or going about this problem, essentially it dissolves in some respects traditional views as to the nature of the relation between mind and matter, while at the same time, though, preserving this sense of continuity between mind and matter. The fact that I can raise my arm volitionally, and we can say, okay, that was done through a consciously intended act. And so one could say, yeah, that was your mind, in some sense of the word, exerting some kind of willed plan or action of some kind through the body. So it's not something like there's two separate worlds or two separate substances.
Is this like a relational theory kind of thing?
Well, I mean, pessimistic idealism is going to say that it's all of one mental substance, like similar to how we were saying it's physical.
Yeah, I prefer experiential.
I know Jack is a dualist and Khalil is a dualist so far as well. So,
well, he's not. I don't think Jack is a substance dualist.
I'm a holomorphic. I'm a holomorphic dualist.
He's not committed.
That's right.
To that. I'm not sure.
I'm not a substance dualist.
Okay, fair enough. So, in what sense are you a dualist? You're just
it's like perspectival dualism, which maybe property dualism, maybe.
Like theory of go ahead.
It's just the idea that, well, I mean, it's a complicated view to explain, but the basic idea is that there's a first-person point of view and there's a third-person point of view. We can switch back and forth between them, but each one is irreducible to and non-identifiable with the other.
Okay, yeah. So like the idea of like intentionality with the S that I was saying before, like you'd say like if that exists, that like entails what you're talking about, kind of.
I guess I'd have to think about whether the intentional with an S is some distinctive property of the mental, but the intentional with a T.
But you don't want to say.
All right, guys, my headphones are down. I gotta jump off here. Good talk, Neil.
Yeah, good talk. You don't want to say that that from these two different perspectives, it's not just two different ways of talking about what might be the same thing, right? You want to say, right? I mean, it's not some sort of conceptual dualism.
That's
it's
right.
Something more than that. But I mean, it seems. I don't know how we can avoid either property dualism or substance dualism, but I don't know. I mean,
do you think that those? Yeah, if you're going to cache it that way as almost two fully and wholly distinct things, like I feel like the way you put it first when you said there's a first person and a third person view, it's like if I was to just ask like what are those views of, wouldn't you say they're the same thing?
No, he wouldn't.
So then
I would say that. I think we have different. I accept a sort of conceptual dualism. That's entirely, and I can kind of explain my views on that. But here, there's sort of arguments, and there's this whole view for thinking that no, they can't be identified in that way.
But you still say that you like identity theory, though. And do you think that that's like at odds with what you were talking about?
I do.
Now?
Well, it's not. I don't think it's consistent with Jack's view, but it's consistent with what I call, which is sometimes called like conceptual dualism. That's just to say, right, that we have different like sets of concepts, different ways of speaking, more or less, about the same thing. Actually, strictly speaking, conceptual dualism is consistent with dualism, but the conceptual dualism I'm talking about is just that there are different concepts, and as it turns out, what those concepts refer to, or what we use them to refer to, in some cases, it's the same
Some
thing.
type of semantic distinction.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like you could get to far more
Yeah.
than two in often cases. I mean, like you
Yeah,
have,
but, multiply like linguistic, practices as much as you want, right? You can have a great many that could ultimately be used to refer to the same thing. And the point is that, like, in the same way that, actually, and I think in a much similar way, more similar way than people take for granted, you can refer to the same things in sort of the terms of like water and opacity and stuff, and you can also refer to that in terms of using terms of like chemistry, right? You can refer to the same patch of the world, so to speak. You can refer to the same stuff.
right.
Doesn't that boil down to a materialistic reductionism eventually?
I mean, I would say like I could identify with a view like that. Like, I mean, I don't see an issue with reduction. I actually see more of an issue with like non-reductionist physicalist views than reductionist ones, because usually there's something called strong emergence that comes out of non-reductionist views, which is basically just these jumps between states that have no real connection between them. Like, there's nothing being explained. There's just like, you have this, and then this just like poofs into existence from that. So
the strong emergence is a whole other matter, because there's like the way that Chalmers thinks about it in terms of I think he talks about it in terms of derivability versus non-derivability or something like that. But then you have other people that give a sort of powers view of something being strongly emergent, right? The emergent phenomena is strongly emergent if it has novel powers that none of its base has, and so forth. And there's other views. I don't know. I talked to Mumford. He has that sort of view. But it's kind of weird because to think about reduction in a sense, right? Because in the way that I'm thinking about things, in that, like, oh, there's different ways of talking about the world, right? And a sort of or different ways of talking about certain aspects of the world. And so certain things have mental properties, and I have a view about how we refer to those and so forth. That's a whole other issue.
I don't see
certain things.
How do you account for intentionality or truth tracking or something with a reductionist view? Wouldn't it be just basically just random processes that?
Well, you have a complex system that's trying to represent. It's trying to create a model. It's trying to represent things, right?
So it'd be like a computer. It'd be like a computer software that's translating all of the sensory data.
I actually don't think that consciousness is a computational physical process. Like, I actually like Penrose's views on this. Like, that he thinks that it has to be something that's non-computational, but it could still be physical. Like, but the idea is that.
You take the like Searle sort of objection seriously and stuff. Right. The computational view of the mind or the functions views. I think I agree that those are problematic.
I got lost a little bit from where we were going with that.
Yeah, but he asked about intentionality. I think
right. So intentionality is trying problem. When you have something that's trying to build a model and reflect something in an accurate way, like you're already building in a capacity to fail with respect to a goal, right? That just comes out of that, in my opinion. Like, representational objects are automatically normative in that way because they're trying to accurately represent something.
Yeah, well, maybe. But I was going to say something.
Views, right? Detroit, you're not a representationalist, but Quantum, you are, right? With respect to...
Yeah, I think so.
I don't have a fully worked out view on intentionality. I do think that some of the stuff that, for example, Papineau talks about in terms of correlations developing between various attitudes and thoughts that we have and stuff obtaining in the world is going to be central to it, but more than that is needed because you get spurious correlations and so forth.
Just for a little context, real quick, I spend most of my time in epistemology, logic, and so I haven't done a whole lot on philosophy of mind. So if my questions seem a bit elementary, that would be why. That's the next area I'm going to tackle, but I haven't done too much there.
I hate the philosophy of mind.
Of like some people are representationalists, and I'm not a representationalist in the strong sense. Where
I mean, I probably
the strong sense of representationalism is supposed to be that our what we might call our perceptual states are like intrinsically sort of representational. They have this representational quality necessarily, and that I don't. That's a sort of strong version of representationalism that I don't accept. I do think there's some weaker version of that where they don't have it necessarily, but like contingently for certain other features is probably fine. But
pessimistic idealism and I were discussing like sensation and things like that, and like I don't know if sensation would necessarily be representational in like a strict sense. So like I'm not saying like is a representationalist saying that all mental states are representational? Because
no,
I will say
no. All perceptual states. Like, look,
if I hear necessary or necessarily one more time.
So suppose you're I don't know, you have a visual experience, right? The representationalist will say that that sort of visual experience is sort of just like intrinsically representational. It has its intentional quality just in virtue of being an experience like that. And that's
okay. I mean, maybe I would agree with something like that.
Yeah.
I might agree with something like that. It's a little bit murky though, but yeah, I mean, it seems to me that like in a lot of ways, like the mind, and when you were asking about the structure of experience or like the structure of like mind, it does seem like very representational to me. And that's not to say that, so even on a view where like an idealistic view or like a hard solipsist view where like the mind is the only thing there is, right? Let's say like hard solipsism is true. It's still like in my view, like that would still be representational, like to that mind. It's like it's constructing representations that it's perceiving.
Of what?
Well, it's of whatever it's of whatever like character it assigns to it. I mean, it's trying to figure that out, right? That's the idea.
Would you say it's representing like the internal cognitive processes at that point? If hard solipsism is true?
If it's hard solipsism, then like it almost
there's not really much to represent.
Well, it's everything is being
internally, yes, but outside of that, by definition, no. If hard solipsism is true.
Yeah, there's nothing external that's being represented, but like, there's something that's being presented, like to the subject as experience.
Yeah,
right?
to the subject. Yeah. Are any of you ontological monists, by the way?
Depends upon what kind of monism we mean. I think so.
Yeah,
I would think so also.
Like existence monism, or like priority monism, or substance monism.
No, some form of existence monism.
Oh,
but there's only one token object.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't think so. No. I always think of like being frozen in place whenever I think of like modal collapse or existence monism. That's what
I definitely get that sense of existence monism. It's kind of really I don't know.
Wait,
I mean, I see how people could arrive at it. I mean, it seems like okay.
Yeah.
What is being invented by existence monism in the sense of I would be an existence monist in the sense that like I believe that the only thing which is fundamentally real is God.
So that would be a bit different.
Well, by fundamentally real, because that might be different. Because that might be, you know, in a way, you think there is one fundamenta, but that's but there could be different objects. I mean, and there may even be different substances. Maybe I'm not sure.
Yeah, but I think that they would be like substances in like a nominal sense almost. Because they're not like they don't actually like have like a distinct ontological existence, but they might have like a functional difference to the mind which perceives it.
It seems like
Would you say that God is the only object that exists? God is the only only thing that exists.
I would definitely argue that. Yeah, I would argue that.
Then you might be an existence monist. Yeah. Because existence monism, again, is just the thesis that there's only one. There's one object that exists, right? The priority monist just says that what's fundamental is the whole world, so to speak. There's one thing that is like fundamental.
Yeah, those two seem connected too, right? There's overlap there.
They're not really necessarily connected. You could be one or not be the other. Either way.
I think that
I guess
you could be both, right?
I guess you can't be a substance monist, but not. Sorry, you can't be an existence monist, but not a substance monist, I guess, because there's only one object. So, unless you reject substance talk altogether, which I kind of do.
Yeah, I think that would be like, for instance, going back to the part of the conversation where we were talking about like how truth tracking. Forgive me, by the way, if my microphone is bad because I'm on a hike, but like how truth tracking is like possible with sort of this non-reductionist model. I would definitely say that a reductionist model, in the sense of like along the lines of, I guess, like Kant's analytic unity of self-apperception. If I'm getting the exact terminology correctly, like that's definitely correct. But and the mind, as we call it, is real in the sense that the mind is like this patchwork which pieces together experiential information. However, it's sort of this non-reductionist model. I would definitely say that a real existing object that is like distinct from other minds, or is distinct from like one fundamental mind. I wouldn't like argue that.
Okay, yeah. See, it's weird because I'm gonna have like a weird like substance monist view as well, but yeah, again, like I was saying before, like I think that thing is just like a substance that's described by laws, and then like it answers like questions that like have been presented in physics of like, oh, like what breeds fire into the equations. It's like, all right, we're just gonna like stick a substance in there, basically. Like if you could get down to like a fundamental description of like what everything that we're seeing around us like is emerging from, basically, because like we have theories now in physics that go towards like space and time being emergent, and it's hard to really wrap your head around that, but it does start to look kind of metaphysical. So it's like, okay, if you can give a description of how that happens, and then like maybe it goes deeper, obviously, like, but at the end of the day, you're going to have some kind of like substance that's actually being described by those descriptions, essentially.
But wouldn't that just lend credence to the idea that space and time then are not necessarily like real, like in the strong sense, like real distinct features of reality, but are instead kind of like structures of the mind? I mean, there's multiple theories that account for that, but that's like one particular one.
For me, it's like I'm starting like, so my foundation is a physical foundation, but I'm saying that like if you were to take something like a wave and say that you could reduce the description down to like the water molecules that make that wave up, and like the description of their mechanical trajectories, like how they're going to move, and like the ensemble of all of that information is like, you can zoom out at it and say like there's a wave there, and like we know what a wave looks like. The wave's not non-real just because it has this more fundamental description. So that's how I would look at it. Like something that's emergent is not necessarily like non-real.
I think I find a lot of this talk about fundamentality to be sort of confused, but that's just a whole issue.
It's used in a more physical sense there, but like you can use it as an illustration too. Yeah. So
I personally don't like the term because it usually implies the smallest is the most real, or in some like the smallest thing. That's usually like what it presupposes that.
Yeah,
well, I don't think it's size. It's not about size,
or even what's more fundamental, even if it's not more small, right? Because there's this like idea that like suppose you were a priority monist. or suppose you were a priority monist and you thought that what's fundamental was like the whole universe. And actually, I think Schaffer
Jonathan
takes some hints from quantum mechanics, right? Thinking that for the support of his view, it's like it's the wave function of the whole world. So maybe that's the sort of prior thing.
No. But that's what I'm talking about, because it's the fundamental description of the whole world is going to be like what's at root of all the other phenomena that you're seeing. So it's just like to say that like, oh, we know what causes a wave at these physical at these physical descriptions that go down to like atoms, molecules, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But like it's just giving you more of the actual information that's present there when you give that description, right? And it's like you're getting down to like the more simple laws that describe this, and then like you get all the way down to like these simple laws that literally describe the entire universe, right? So it's not size based.
Yeah, it's just like, but there's this idea that, if we think that this, like the universe or whatever's smallest or, whatever we take to be most fundamental, if we do, is somehow more real in a way than the things which are less fundamental. That I think is sort of, I think that's wrong. I don't,
right.
Well, even if we grant that,
I agree
maybe, I don't know why we would, but suppose we say that the whole universe is fundamental, and everything sort of else is less fundamental than that, like humans or whatever, doesn't mean they're less real than the whole world. I think that intuition, like people often have that intuition that whatever's more fundamental, that's like what really exists.
Well, what
and
do
then
they
everything
mean
else
by fundamental though? Because if you say like it's like if I give you a description that describes the whole world,
right,
and then that's like from that description you derive all of the elements of it. Like is that kind of what it's saying? Because I would agree with something like that.
So Schaffer defines the fundamental in terms of like grounding relation, the fundamenta is that which is ungrounded, blah, blah, blah. And but grounding relation itself is itself a primitive relation. Like I talked with Jessica Wilson, she has kind of the opposite view. She thinks what counts as fundamental is in some sense a primitive, but the grounding relation can then be various grounding relations. I guess she rejects the grounding relation, but she rejects like various relations which can be considered under the more general scheme of grounding, that those are going to be determined in terms of what is fundamental and other features. I personally, I think I find the whole sort of discussion just unnecessary and confused. If we can stipulate, okay, whatever, the whole world, that's what we're taking to be fundamental, and then we can make some inferences on that given various other metaphysical principles, maybe. But like, why? We could just as easily, and in my view, no less accurately stipulate that some simples are, if there are any, are the fundamenta, like what, and then make derivations from that. Like, it's just additional language. I don't think we're getting at some deep metaphysical truth by talking about what is fundamental.
I think definitely though that fundamentality does equal like reality, because what it is to not be fundamental is to be in some way constitutive, and in that sense, or even if you don't want to say constitutive, I would say contingent, in the sense that the less fundamental a thing, whatever that thing may be, the more conditions must be met in order for its existence. And that therefore puts it in a state of less being for a thing which does not have more conditions.
We were talking about this earlier.
This talk about less being doesn't make sense to me. Like, take a table.
Use of contingent is like the colloquial use too.
Is a table less fundamental than its parts?
Yeah, definitely. Sorry, I'm in a car, but yeah, definitely, I would say so, because the wood that's in the table, say it's a wooden table, does not have the conditions of its existence that it must be constituted in a particular way. It's, the table.
Look, but that's just to say that the table and its parts have different persistence conditions. They have, I mean, that's fine, right? Obviously, those parts can continue in other shapes, whereas the table cannot.
when the
But
term is
that
used,
doesn't. What does that have to do with how the table is less fundamental? I don't.
yeah, I mean,
It's usually determined from the outs. It's determined from the outside. It's externally determined. It doesn't have its determinations within itself. This is something that Hegel would bring up. The finite is always determined from the outside. It always is one among other things, rather than something which has within itself its own, if you want to use the term, like principle of self-determination. Something like that would be infinite, and for him that would be the whole of things, which is the most real. There's like a what's the word? Oh god damn it, what is it called? There's a relation between I don't want to use the word amount, but I'm going to have to use it, between the amount of external determination and its reality. Basically, the most externally determined thing is the least real, while the most real, or the real as such, the whole for Hegel, it has all of its determinations within itself. So that's like,
when you talk about determinations, is this, if something, for example, take something that's, as you'd say, determined mostly from the outside. Does that have to do with like boundaries, or how exactly are you thinking about that?
You could think of it as boundaries or properties or aspects. Something self-contained is something that has all of its determinations within itself. Something that is not self-contained but relies upon an other, makes reference to an other that is something other than itself. That is something that's determined from the outside. It's extrinsically determined in some kind of, if you want to put it that way. It's contingent upon other things, something other than itself, for it to be what it is, basically.
What pessimistic idealism too is talking about has to do with like your identification of a thing in your experience. So he's coming from a sense of like, when you refer to the table, like you're talking about something that's in your perceptual awareness, and like even if I wanted to sit here and go like, oh, it's this thing made of atoms that are like floating around, blah blah blah. Like he's gonna say, well, like that's not what I am even referring to when I talk about a table. Like,
well,
I'm talking about this thing that's in my awareness. That's not the same as this thing.
I wouldn't say that.
We're gonna have more fundamental disagreements.
I wouldn't say that.
Can I give an example? If someone says something is a planet, something's being a planet, it depends in an important way on external features. For example, there has to be a star, and there has to be certain other features like that. Is that the sort of things that would count as it being more limited, externally determined?
Yes.
Okay.
So in the thing about I would say that the atoms just constitute one aspect of it, of the what did you say, a chair or something?
Whatever.
So I wouldn't say that the chair, the atoms are not something that I mean when I'm talking about I mean that the chair in its totality. That's like the whole chair. Yeah. So that the stuff is
atoms are going to represent kind of.
It can't be a part of our mean, because presumably we can talk about chairs and be sort of neutral on its composition.
I mean, when I speak of the chair as such, I mean that it's the chair in its totality, in all of its. So in all
maybe we are actually pointing to the two things when I'm like, oh, a bunch of atoms over there, and you're like, yeah, maybe that is the same thing in the chair, but like
we grasp the same. Yeah.
When you and I are like, yeah, okay, we grasp the same thing. So there actually is a chair external to both of us. Okay.
Sure.
But you think it's comprised of like mentality, right?
Meanings. That's usually most fundamentally meanings. That's the issue. It's a unity of meaning, to use like Husserl's terminology, and it discloses itself to us in various ways.
So, like, what accounts for like different things in the natural order? Like what accounts for like the law-like behaviors and things like that, or like induction, or like what accounts for like regularities and like what we might consider physical laws?
Well, the universe is a rational system. It's a rational system of meanings entailing one another. And essentially, if you had the whole universe mapped out in front of you right now, you'd be able to trace you'd be able to trace everything from everything else.
So do you
It'd be like the flower in the
theories
granite wall.
where they talk about the universe as like a giant brain? Have you ever seen that?
Yeah.
Have you ever seen the cosmic web like images and like?
I've seen this stuff like, oh look, this galaxy looks like a neuron. It's like, oh my god.
I mean, that's just
those are
just
actually like giant strings of galaxies. Yeah, they're actually. I get you.
I've heard that there's some thoughts about why those structures resemble each other on different scales is because you have
if it's a self-repeating structure,
forces.
that's okay. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
You have forces at different scales, and they result in similar sorts of structures because I don't know, something about them being sort of lower energy solutions. Whatever. There's some stuff about how you can get similar structures at different levels.
Darcy Thompson pill.
I guess I would consider the universe in some sense the term like a self-repeating structure. But I believe experience has a kind of structure that is in some sense, I don't want to say fractal, but it's differentiated in such a way.
Speaking, yeah.
It's differentiated in such a way that it has these almost like different axes, basically. Yeah. That like there's like a feeling aspect, a subject aspect. There's like a presentational. There's like it branches out in different into many different directions. But all of those directions exhibit a similar patterns of meanings and intention. Like I mean, it's very. It has a very peculiar structure that is different from. It's so difficult to describe because there's really nothing else. We have to basically isolate experience and all of its contents from its structure and compare its structure to the structure of one of the contents of experience, basically, like, for example, a chair or a table. So it's very difficult to try and illustrate or describe the structure of experience as compared to the structure of a table or a chair, without, of course, relying on like spatial terminology, like or just using like something which is like what was being said before, like intentionality. Okay, well, there's more to experience than just intention. There's a more there's something about it that's
ephemeral,
more
or something like that.
It's more what's the word? It's something like a system, as opposed to it's like a system that has various what's the word? Dimensions. That's probably a good way to put it. And these dimensions are continuous. They're differentiated, and they're differentiated for a subject dimension of that experience. So I am distinct from the patch of red in my visual field, let's say, and that is distinct from it's presented to me, but it is nevertheless, though, still one with my experience, as am I one with my experience as well in some respect. But
have you ever heard of a strange loop?
Yeah,
I usually like that concept, and like I was saying like earlier that I like a lot of the ideas that like consciousness is non-computational and things like that. Hierarchical loops, right? Like, and the other thing too is that like there's theories of consciousness again that go like to Penrose, and like Penrose and Hameroff have this paper about how. Or I think they wrote it based on another paper about how anesthesia gas molecules like bind to these certain
microtubules and things like
microtubules in the brain, and when they're like, hey, those are like the only place that we might be able to have like some quantum shit happening. So like let's try to come up with some models that like use that or whatever. And like as far as I know, I know Tom actually interviewed a guy a while ago, and I think his name is like Anirban like Sandiopa or something like that.
Boy.
He's one of the scientists that's like in that theory, and he's talking about the devices that they have that they're trying to use to like probe to like see if they, because it's like you can't even disturb like that system to try to study it if that's what's happening, you know. And people be like, oh, the time scales are too fast for it to have anything to do with this and blah blah blah. But like, I think Tegmark wrote a paper about it. He was like, the time scales are too fast, like for these quantum interactions to have anything to do with like consciousness, basically, like, or what we call. But he like puts in the paper, but like, yeah, but pretty much like only if it's computational, and it's like, that's what Penrose has kind of always been saying, is that it's, I don't know. I think like we'll eventually understand how it works, but it's going to be like there's going to have to be another Einstein before we understand like how the brain really like actually works. But
I mean, I think we'll be able to understand the brain just fine. But now that's like, it will be